short two-person panel prior to lunch. It's called The Former Slave Speaks. Our moderator is Padilla Peralta, a Roman Republican historian from Princeton, also known for his connection of Roman history to contemporary political events through his journalism, and also the best-selling author of Undocumented.
Well, I don't think I need a mic, so I will just project from here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our two panelists this morning. The proceedings will go as they have gone. Each of them will give a 15-minute paper, and then we'll open it up to spirited conversation. Leading off is Rose MacLean, who will be giving a paper entitled Pro libertate dedit, representing the cost of freedom in Roman Italy. Rose is an assistant professor of classics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and received her PhD in classics from Princeton in 2012. Then, next in the lineup is Gema Ortega, who is a lecturer in English at Dominican University and received her PhD in comparative and world literature from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2011. And she will be giving a talk entitled The Cost of Freedom for Juan Francisco Manzano, a Cuban Cimarrón. So please, without any further ado, join me in welcoming our first speaker, Rose.
Thank you, Danielle, and thanks to everyone for being here and having such a stimulating conference so far. My talk is looking primarily at the epitaphs of Roman freedmen in Italy in the first 2 centuries CE to think about what they might be able to tell us about how freedmen represented the costs of freedom. Roman freedmen commissioned burial monuments in substantially higher proportions than did freeborn aristocrats or freeborn plebeians. Through the process of erecting a tombstone, ex-slaves made choices about how to depict themselves, their achievements, and their relationships, albeit within conventional norms. These artifacts provide a rich source of evidence for the strategies that freedmen employed to construct their personae in a burial context. Tombs of Roman freedmen are often interpreted by historians in terms of the benefits that manumission conferred, above all, admission to the citizenship. With citizenship came the right to own and transmit property, to form a legal marriage, and to produce freeborn citizen children. Funerary portraits that were in vogue during the late Republic and Augustan period have supported the claim that ex-slaves wanted to advertise their new status. And here you can see the family of the Servilii. You see that the married couple is on the right and the man is wearing a toga, which is reserved for Roman citizens. On the left is their freeborn son, Globulus, one of my favorite names. And he has a toga and the boule, which is the amulet worn by young freeborn boys. More recent accounts complicate the binary of pride and shame, but still emphasize the rewards of manumission, in particular the stability of the family after the pressures of enslavement had been alleviated. Most freed commemorators do focus on positive elements. However, a select few integrate the cost of freedom into the monument's overall message. These outliers are worthy of our attention, not because they illuminate pervasive trends, but because they document strategies through which individuals negotiated the meaning of freedom. I begin by discussing an exceptional monument that portrays manumission price not just as a private expense, but as a contribution to the civic good. Turning next to a collection of epitaphs that include birthplace or ethnic origins, otherwise known as natio, I argue that some freed commemorators assess the loss of their homeland against integration into the Roman community. Connecting the past to the present helped to articulate costs associated with this type of freedom that was bestowed by manumission at Rome. In the town of Assisium, which is Assisi, during the first half of the 1st century CE, an eye doctor named Publius Decimus Eros Merula commissioned the following inscription. Publius Decimus Eros Merula, attending doctor, surgeon, oculist, and sewer, which is a municipal office typically held by freed slaves, although not exclusively so. This man gave 50,000 sesterces for his freedom, pro libertate dedit. This man gave 2,000 sesterces to the state for the office of sewer. This man gave 30,000 sesterces for the erection of statues in the Temple of Hercules. This man gave 37,000 sesterces to the public treasury for a street paving project. On the day before he died, he left as a legacy an unknown number of sesterces, and it's unknown because the inscription, as you can see, is broken at the bottom. Note the emphasis that this freedman's professional expertise takes in the opening lines. This helps to explain his wealth and standing after manumission, but does so with reference to the past. It was presumably through success as a doctor during captivity that he amassed the funds necessary to pay such a hefty manumission price. The inclusion of this figure does more than simply highlight his monetary value. Interpreted alongside the occupational titles, it demonstrates his capacity to generate wealth even before he became a free person. In this context, manumission price creates a bridge to the past, while also marking an important transition. At the same time, the epitaph represents self-purchase as a first step toward participation in public life. Each line that identifies an expense undertaken by the deceased begins with the demonstrative hic, or this man, and ends with a number. And this framing is more obvious in the Latin, but trust me, it's there. Manumission price is linked with civic benefactions, and self-purchase emerges as a quasi-public event, or at least one that bears important implications for the community. The naming of manumission price instantiates this doctor's labor during enslavement and connects that work to his freedom and financial success. Manumission price assumes the qualities of a public act in light of his subsequent actions. The subtlety with which this epitaph balances the monetary cost of freedom against social and political benefits offers a point of departure for considering how similar strategies might be applied to depicting other costs, including those associated with natal alienation. And I don't have to tell this audience that that concept has been elegantly developed by our keynote for today, Professor Patterson. In the longer paper, I make an attempt to examine the disruption of family ties as a result of manumission, but here I focused on just a few examples of freedmen who had been separated from their homelands. Deracination was arguably a cost of enslavement rather than of freedom, but when freed commemorators cite their natal origins, they interpret the significance of that loss in relation to their current status. In some cases, the inscription of origins can be interpreted as an attempt to activate ties severed by involuntary migration. In others, the loss of one's homeland is balanced against certain positive gains that attended manumission. This is emphatically not to say that freedmen somehow appreciated servitude because it gave them the opportunity to become Roman. It's a very kind of Roman thing to think, as you'll see at the end of the paper. But rather, these commemorators strategically represent their origins to shape the monument's message. My corpus of inscriptions contains 189 epitaphs that attest the birthplace of at least one slave, freedman, or person of uncertain status, who in the scholarship are given the unfortunate title of incerti. Sorry. The high proportion of epitaphs with a commemorator of uncertain status may stem from the tendency to focus on the deceased, as well as from the high numbers of incerti in Latin epigraphy more generally. In epitaphs where status is either certain or probable, roughly the same proportions were commemorated by and for slaves, so you can see that's the darker blue That's 13% of the total. Roughly the same proportions were for foreign buy slaves as were foreign buy freedmen, which is 12%, which is the red. Very few were set up by a freeborn person for a slave, just 3%, and even fewer by a freeborn person for a freedman, just 1%. So the conclusion I draw from this tentatively is that this seems to be something that freed slaves are including when they represent one another, as opposed to it being an imposition on the commemorand by a master or patron. Where freedmen are concerned, natal origins might interact productively with references to political integration, family ties, and professional success. The sarcophagus of Gaius Iulius Mygdonius provides a detailed example of how freedmen's homeland and Roman citizenship might relate to each other. Gaius Iulius Mygdonius, Parthian by birth, I was born free, captured at a young age, sent to Roman territory. When I became a Roman citizen, with fate assisting, I set up this coffin when I was 50 years old. I sought to make it through to old age from puberty. Now receive me willingly, stone. With you I will be released from care. In this dedication, an acknowledgement of the rupture imposed by captivity coincides with a desire to attest natal origins, as well as to claim inclusion in the citizen body. Very few inscriptions offer such a detailed account, but a first-person epitaph for a freedwoman named Valeria Lisiska claims that at the age of 12 I came to Rome, which gave me the rights of a citizen. Separation from one's homeland could also be balanced by positive evaluations of domestic virtues or occupational skill. The epitaph of a freedwoman, Amatia Callista, claims that she was so pious that she left her fatherland, presumably to reunite with her son Baphilus, who served as a slave on the emperor's staff. It's impossible to know whether Callista sold herself into slavery in hopes of coming to Rome or immigrated after manumission, but alluding to the challenges posed by enslavement highlights her commitment to her family. Commemorators combine birthplace or ethnicity with occupational titles relatively often, a phenomenon which reflects the importance of vocational titles among slaves and ex-slaves much more broadly. In certain professions, descent from a particular town or region could enhance credibility or add to one's resume. This applies to physicians and members of the learned occupations, but also to tradesmen and gladiators, among others. In the 1st century BCE, a freed doctor named Lucius Mannaeus commissioned an epitaph in the town of Volce. Lucius Mannaeus, freedman of Quintus, a doctor, made this while living. By birth, he was Menecrates, son of Demetrius of Tralles. A doctor and prescriber of wine, he made this while living. Maximus Adria, illegitimate daughter of someone, good, righteous, frugal, hail. And you can see in this case, I did put the Latin because there's also Greek. So this is a bilingual inscription. And it switches into Greek when it starts talking about, by nature, Phusei, he was Menecrates, and it gives his name in Greek. I should also point out that the term for freedman, libertas, has been restored in this inscription, so he doesn't actually say explicitly that he was a freedman. We have to extrapolate that from the context. The commemorator ascribes to Maximus Adria, who was probably his wife, notably Roman virtues. But this gesture toward assimilation is preceded by a forceful statement of continuity with his own background. He wishes posterity to know that by birth he was named Menecrates, son of Demetrius, and that he came from Tralles, which was an important center for the medical profession. Conveying this information in Greek buttresses the doctor's overlapping claims to natal origins and expertise. Another fascinating example of the synergy between birth and vocation appears in an inscription from Augustan Rome that names Lucius Lutatius Pacius, who's an incense dealer from the familia of King Mithridates. And familia was the term typically used for slave household. Pacius may have advertised his connection to the royal house of Pontus to mark himself as a dealer not just of incense, but of a famous antidote against poison said to have been developed by Mithridates VI. If this is true, the reference to Pacius's origins functions to convey in coded terms his unique capabilities, which would be necessarily oblique in an area where poisons were heavily restricted by law. Roman freedmen encountered unique pressures as they were absorbed into their ex-master's lineage and exposed to myriad social prejudices. Freedmen also faced the challenge of establishing themselves as members of the free community. In this environment, separation from one's homeland could be recorded and weighed against more positive outcomes to craft a specific persona. By engaging in funerary culture to the extent that they were able, Roman freedmen might exercise a modicum of authority over the representation of freedom, even if they fundamentally lacked control over the terms of manumission itself. All too often, and I include myself in this criticism, ancient historians concentrate on what slaves gained upon manumission, whether that be citizenship, wealth, or relief from the threat of sale away from the family and friends. Literary sources contain passing remarks about costs associated with release from captivity, but these are usually colored by the master's perspective and by generic concerns. To cite one prominent example, a satirical author under Nero named Petronius has a freed character suggest that he became a slave willingly with the intention of gaining Roman citizenship, all to avoid paying taxes. So he's having a sort of back and forth with another character who is of a higher social status. And the freedman says, "You're a Roman knight, are you? Well, my father was a king." "Why, are you only a freedman, did you say? I wanted to be a Roman citizen, not a subject with taxes to pay. And today I hope no one can laugh at the way I live. I'm a man among men, and I walk with my head up." Self-sale is attested in the Roman world, but Petronius' goal is not to comment on the historical sources of slaves, but rather to mock freedmen's ability to acknowledge freedom's costs as well as its benefits. The inscriptional evidence, while exceedingly sparse, has the potential to illuminate another dimension of this problem, not by revealing freedmen's subjective thoughts or emotions, but by indicating what rhetorical strategies could be used to depict freedom in burial culture. Thank you.
While we set this up, I guess I want to start kind of thinking about how it's been kind of an area of contention, right? Throughout the 2 days that we have been together, whether the archive or the literary voice is the good source of access to understanding a little bit more about the cost of the slavery. My paper is actually concentrated on the actual voice of the slave, yet problematize a little bit the fact that a slave can actually speak from a point in which the literature allows really to expose his, in my particular case, real identity and cognitive understanding of who he is. So that's what my paper is going to be about. I don't have any PowerPoint.
Sorry, yeah, I
don't have any. Just me talking.
Sorry.
No, not at all. I should have said that before. I think I've just done. So that's kind of where I want to kind of get us today, right? Kind of thinking about whether the voice of the slave can be really counted as the real access and window into the subjectivity of the writer. So Juan Francisco Manzano's Autobiografía de un esclavo, Autobiography of a Slave, is a remarkable account for being the only surviving document who we know of its kind, not only in Cuba, but in all of Spanish America. Whereas Anglophone slaves left a relatively significant number of accounts in comparison, the cultural and political awareness, the cultural and political circumstances that surround the autobiography might shed light in the differences that writing about slavery had in the still colonial environment of the mid-1800s in Cuba, and on the cultural tradition of Afro-Hispanic writers in the Western Hemisphere. According to Henry Louis Gates Jr., writing for slave authors in the Americas was an act, quote, of self-creation with words, end quote. It meant a transformation of the slave's body from object of the discourse to the speaking subject, with the capacity to reflect, organize, and speak about his or her experience. Language itself becomes in these accounts the site of negotiation of humanity, which was negated to those who could not, quote again, write themselves into existence. For only exemplar cases of this premise are Frederick Douglass and Richard Wright, whose ability to quote from only construe letters granted them the freedom to, quote again, work out a new identity for themselves, end quote. This artistic orchestration, as Bakhtin would refer to the narrator's voice, in other words, the ability to shape, organize, and give significance and meaning to the events of one's life, was the powerful tool that the authors of slave narratives appropriated to prove their individuality, their humanity, and therefore the moral imperative of abolition. Yet, I argue in this paper that unlike Douglass and Wright, Manzano does not work out a new identity. He does indeed the opposite. He deconstructs himself to the moment in which he can escape, when he finally steps out of the discourse of otherness that has been created for him, because he recognizes that it's futile to attain freedom within the confines of otherness. Toni Morrison herself tempers Gates and Olney's highly optimistic celebration of the power of words in the slave narratives. She points out that the slave narratives had the burden of having to prove the author's authenticity according to the expectations of a highly influential audience who possessed the power to determine an author's future as a free subject. Thus, the author's discourse of freedom to create themselves and their identities as individuals is decided, regulated, and policed by an audience who is not so much interested in the narrator's memories and unique arrangements, their autobiographies per se, but on discourses that justified abolition according to the audience's sensitivity, their moral and cultural norms, and their own pre-assumptions about the truth of the experience of being a slave. Olney affirms that, in a sense, quote, the narrative lives of the ex-slaves were as much possessed and used by abolitionists as their actual lives had been by slaveholders. Professor Patterson himself suggests that the framework of slavery was reinforced by the potential of freedom, whether it was to be granted by slaveholders through manumission, or in this case, I argue, by white abolitionist audience who could exercise their political influence to determine the future lives of not only the narrators, but the entire population of slaves whom they had been called to represent in the narrative. Slave narratives and their voices then exist within a paradoxical tension. For the author to have a shot at physical legal freedom, his or her subjectivity needs to be abridged to conform to a discourse of otherness sanctioned by a wide audience who still exercise control over their words. We should question whether subjectivity within this framework of physical, political, and discursive oppression could serve us at all. The answer in Juan Francisco Manzano Autobiografía is no. Manzano's attempt to acquire voice is not only sabotaged by the circumstances that surround the production and publication of the text, but also, more importantly, by the author himself. Critical readings of the text, like the ones offered by Molloy and Gallego, argue that Manzano builds his subjectivity through the narrative despite the physical as well as discursive oppression. This analysis, in my opinion, is only partial and does not take into account the end of the narrative itself and Manzano's unfrustrated desire to write a second part of the autobiography once he had acquired his freedom. I argue instead, as I said, that Manzano offers two opposite yet simultaneous narratives. While he builds and materializes the character the audience expects him to be, his subjectivity is dismantled. And as the novel progresses to the end, when Manzano can escape the discursive oppression of otherness. So how does Manzano build up the character for the audience? This is the first part, and then I will talk about the deconstruction. Like his northern counterparts, Manzano had also a patron, and this patron was Domingo del Monte, who in 1835 commissioned the writing of Manzano's experience as a slave. Yet Del Monte intended Manzano's narrative to argue for a reformist project of decolonization and nation formation within the island of Cuba that would pit the Criollo aristocracy against Spanish landowners. That project of liberation of the nation was fraught, though, as in many other instances in the Americas in general, with anxieties about the African population of the island. The nation was to be white and culturally homogeneous. Therefore, Afro-Cubans were never thought to be active participants in the formation of national identity. Thus, Domingo del Monte, as the intellectual leader of the national Criollo elite, did not see in the discourse of his slave year an opportunity for slaves to speak up or against their condition, much less about their vision of an independent country. Indeed, Del Monte's intellectual circle favored the whitening of the Cuban population by returning to Africa the slaves in order to, quote, clean Cuba of that African race without fights or violence. Del Monte's request for Manzano to speak them about this experience within this political framework, as William suggests, was then to advance a larger political and independent national project, which recognized a common interest against the Spanish crown in the British abolitionist movement of the 30s and 40s. The narration of Manzano's experience as a slave that's become an analogy of Cuba vis-a-vis Spain. Cuba, represented by the slave, is being abused by the power of the motherland, Spain, and lives in hope to find its freedom with the help of Great Britain and the United States. For all these reasons, Manzano's autobiography was not published in Manzano's original Spanish until 1937, roughly 100 years after it was written. Richard Madden, a British diplomat who was appointed by Del Monte, translated the autobiography and published it in London in 1840. With a strong desire, that's what he says, a strong desire to bring back to the British public a, quote, perfect picture of Cuban slavery. Richard Madden proceeded to translate the document, as I said, although his mastery of Spanish, as Boutel suggests, appeared dubious when reading the translation side by side by the original. On top of those changes, he also reorganizes the chronological succession of events and altered key elements to suit a foreign audience. He also raised Manzano's name to make the piece anonymous and inserted the text amid a compilation of other voices. In total, more than half of the octavo edition was written by Madden himself, while Manzano's authorial voice virtually disappeared in the process of correction, alteration, translation, compilation of the final book. In the letters that Manzano writes to Almonte on account of his request to write the autobiography, Manzano shows that he indeed is aware of this manipulation. He also knows that he does not have any other alternative but to comply with the request. If he is to attain his legal freedom, Manzano insists that it is Del Monte's hand to guide him, and he used the word guide me, tú me llevas, right? Manzano's awareness of this need to be guided implies his willingness to surrender his agency and voice for the sake of his legal and physical emancipation. That's the process of deconstruction of his own self to build the one desired by Del Monte, his editors, and the ultimate Madden's foreign audiences begin. As a character, Manzano needs to prove the serving of his freedom for being an exceptional and exemplar case closer to the world of the whites than that of other African slaves. Del Monte believed, and he writes this, quote, a person who is born and brought up as a slave, whatever his color or race, might be because of his estate as a base, stupid, and immoral. End quote. It follows then Manzano has to construct himself as a complete opposite. He needs to be represented because of his intelligence, capability, and moral righteousness. He needs to be conscious as well of his place in the world and that his or her political sphere is white. He has to assume the role of what Cypher has called the noble Negro. That is, he had to acquire the traits of the white man by retaining his status as a black man to arouse pity and or admiration as an anomaly. Moreover, in the Latin American tradition and context, as Zamora points out, the good Indian is also feminized in order to assure the political order and governance of the colony is maintained. Yet, one more characteristic needs to be introduced in this case. Since Del Monte's interest to showcase Manzano's story is not to advocate for abolition, but simple reformation to weaken the Spanish stronghold of the island, Manzano's noble character and weak position had to be diametrically opposed to his mistress's cruelty and infamy. Jero Perez affirms that slave owners with Spanish aristocratic origins are indeed at the center of the slave narratives in Cuba, underscoring, quote, that if slaves suffered, it is not because they are rebellious. They know how to be submissive and accept their fate. It is their masters, inhuman beings at the base by their vices, who are to blame for everything. In that sense, Manzano's character in his autobiography there serves as a mere expression of criollos' opposition to the tyranny of colonial Spain and desire for Cuba's independence. He becomes a mirror image of the criollos' predicament. Manzano's character in the autobiography speaks for white criollos, who, unlike Spaniards from Spain, see themselves a paragon of virtue and sacrifice. They see themselves as deserving of freedom, like other keen European nations. Indeed, Israel Moliner, in the first edition of the Spanish original, warns the reader against the belief that Del Monte's ideology had any humanitarian intentions, because what he says, there is always, they do not intend to have them participate, Afro-Cuban participates in a free society where they enjoy the same status and freedom. It is their economic and political rivalries that are behind and run through the discourse of humanitarianism in the slave narratives in Cuba. As a result, it is difficult to see any effort for Manzano to construe a speaking subject with enough agency to negotiate Del Monte's discourse into an identity on his own. On the contrary, he relies on the narcissistic tendencies of the white audiences to satisfy their expectations, using mimicry to reinforce a discourse of power and to his anxieties about Manzano's otherness as a slave. And some of you might recognize Baba's words in there. Manzano adopts in the narratives the values, norms, and culture of his masters, writing, again from Baba, an authorized version of himself that, while endowed with creative abilities, is barren, for it constitutes a mere repetition, a copy of the master. Manzano is first known for his prodigious ability to recite the religious and literary canon. When he gives a used pencil, he recounts, quote, "I waited for them to throw away their model design, and I sat in the corner facing the wall and began to draw mouths, eyes, ears, eyebrows, and teeth. On one occasion, I took a model that had been thrown out. It showed the head and neck of a woman. I copied it so accurately that Mr. Goldfield said that I would become a great portrait painter," end quote. Manzano emphasizes his ability to copiar fielmente, to reproduce accurately his master's faces, while his own is turned around and made invisible. Quote, "Like a parrot, he learns rhetorical techniques from his master's book, yet he cannot argue his own position. When he has an opportunity to learn how to write, he follows the same pattern by tracing his master's own letters from a sheet below, imitating, he says, his own handwriting. Manzano's inability to think, speak, or create on his own is redeemed, according to Malloy, by ultimately achieving his own identity of the, quote, the self as a slave or the slave self as a reader, as a writer, end quote. But in this sense, Manzano is only to materialize as an specter, using, once again, Baba's theoretical framework. In order to Manzano to acquire a self, according to Malloy, he has to do it within the parameters of mimicry and Lacanian selfhood, mirroring the images of the master, both the Monte, as he is writing, and the Marquesa, as he writes himself as a slave. Moreover, Manzano never turns his gaze back upon the eye of power with a unique voice or subjectivity. On the contrary, he acknowledges that his story is not really a story at all, quote again, but a repetition of events all similar to one another, end quote. His narration is as fragmented as the mouths, noises, and ears he is painted, with an semblance that gives him, in this case, coherence. His story is notoriously and intentionally disorganized, frustrating in any kind of linear narrative containing the traditional epiphany that characterizes the Cartesian rational ego. In Manzano's refusal to satisfy the accumulating self, he rejects the personal sign of representation that is limited by the constrictions of the master's discourse. The cost of his legal and physical freedom is his own voice, an alternative and unique text that signifies differently and outside of the discourse of otherness. He refuses to become, in Baba's words, his alienated image, not of a self or another, but the otherness of the self. Manzano's, like Fanon himself, concludes in Black Skin's White Masks, rejects the idea of radicalizing the Lacanian mirror stage as the only alternative. A text and a counter-narrative can be used for the slave to speak. Hall asserts, quote, that Fanon cannot politically live in that ambivalence. Neither can Manzano. While he constructs in the autobiography a character within the limit of his expected otherness, his self is deconstructed, frustrating the master's symbolic order and narcissistic recognition of himself. Do I have one more minute and then I will? The end of Manzano's autobiography constitutes Manzano's exit strategy out of the realms of the master's signification. A house servant, in the only verbal interaction that Manzano had in the narrative with another Afro-Cuban, encourages him to escape. He tells Manzano the way to reach La Habana from Matanzas. He instructs him to rest one of the horses to avoid noise, gives him the spurs and all the necessary supplies to what he tells him is your opportunity, take it. And that's a quote. Kind of. Reluctantly and clearly unprepared for the endeavor, for being, and he's described in the narrative as a mulatico fino, an all too elegant mulatto, which emphasizes the impossibility of attaining one's freedom within the knowledge and disposition of the master. Manzano, quote, saddled the horse for the first time in my life. Thus, the means, ways, and protection for liberation came clearly at the end of the narrative from those who share and know all too well the slave experience. Yet, as Ruiz points out, Francisco Manzano logró ser liberto, no confundirlo con libre, which that means that is his patrons bought his manumission, but not his freedom. His freedom begins at the moment he leaves the house and the other slaves give him their blessing. Dios te lleve con bien, arrea duro, God be with you, right hard and strong. I thought, and this is what Manzano says as a reflection, I thought that nobody had seen me when they were all watching. But no one stopped me. And I learned all of this later. Nobody had seen me, but they were all watching. The gaze in the last lines of the autobiography has shifted. As he prepares to run away, the surveillance of the masters is no longer there. But a different look and recognition has appeared. That of his fellow Afro-Cuban, who, as invisible as he is, are the ones who knowingly watch him escape the narrative, taking control of his own tale. And the last line of the autobiography is, what happened to me later, I'll see it in the second part, which follows this story, end quote. The second part was never written, or was never found, which is very telling. Manzano's value as a slave was his body for the Spanish enslavers, and his otherness for the liberal criollos. As a free man, his voice did not serve as purpose for any national and cultural discourses. It's still controlled by parameters of whiteness. Manzano knows that what Fanon would point later, quote, before it can adopt a positive voice, freedom requires an effort at disalienation. It is through the effort to recapture the self and to scrutinize the self. It is through the lasting tension of their freedom that men will be able to create the ideal conditions of existence, end quote. Manzano's escape into silence indicates the refusal to having to negotiate his identity. His words cannot exist if they are always in contingency with an authorized system of recognition that validates their meaning. Therefore, his silence, emblematic of Afro-Hispanic subjects across the Americas, point out that the ideal conditions, as Fanon would say, might not have been created yet for all subjectivities. If the cost of freedom is having to abridge one's voice, the only way to disalienation, according to Manzano, is to escape the discourse with capital D altogether, never to be seen or to speak again within the confines of its authority.
Many thanks to both of you for splendid papers. In order to get the conversation rolling, I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief. I had two questions, or rather one question that emanates out of both papers. And this has to do with the status of how the former slave is educated to speak. And so I'll pose the question with variations for each of you. With Gema's paper, one thought I had as I listened to it is that in figuring himself as someone who can learn to recite and memorize and perform in these ways, we see Juan Francisco Manzano displaying a mastery of a trope of colonial education in particular that involves, not infrequently, the sort of feat of recitation and memorization, right? He is showing himself then to be an excellent learner on two different registers, in as much as he presents himself as being able to perform this kind of recitation that is a mimicry, as you explained, and to the extent that he shows himself, or figures himself, or is figured, as knowledgeable about what colonial education looks like. With Rose's paper, I had a similarly threaded and inflected thought about education that pertains specifically to the natio inscriptions. So when former slaves tell us that they are from Syria or they are from Arabia, one of the things that they're doing is obviously stating, as you elucidate quite clearly and poignantly, their origins, their place of birth. But they're also showing that they can plug into a Roman cartography of the Mediterranean. They know exactly how the provincial spaces of the empire and the spaces beyond the empire are constituted. And for a former slave to say that he originated in Parthia, especially in the context of Roman-Parthian relations, displays again the sort of twofold register of mastery. And so I thought I'd lay out those considerations for both of you. Obviously, you're welcome. Not to answer them in any way, but to get us thinking about how education works in the training of the former slave to speak, and then of course how ultimately the former slave might, in a series of performative speech acts or non-speech acts, decide to disavow the discourse that is structured around that education.
Yeah, I mean, that's the conundrum for Manzano, right? For most of the narrative, Manzano seemed to be proud of that kind of colonial education as the only way to be a human being, and that's how like humanity is equated. For as long as you can speak Spanish, you can recite the classics, you can like, then it seems that that's what it qualifies him to be a human being. And at the end of the narrative, he has a kind of, if there is an epiphany at all, then that's when he realizes that for him to be free, he really needs to be more instructed in the ways of the outsider. It's not even the other, because the other, again, is fraught with the language of the colonial world as well, right? So it's really the way I read it, is like there is kind of like a physical and discursive stepping out of that draft of colonial education. And he is very aware, and as you were saying, and he takes a very conscious decision, at least for me in the book, to step out of it, to really disavow and say, if I understand what you want me to do, I'm going to do it for my own self-benefit. But once I get what I want, which is my physical freedom, and not to speak again within your language, because that would enslave me again somehow, right? And all in all is also, no one is interested in really hear what he has to say anyways, once he has acquired that freedom, because he doesn't want to speak in the name of otherness, nor to continue mimicking. So whatever he has to say is not useful for anyone. That's what
that gave me some time to think about the last question. Yeah. So the Parthian inscription is fascinating. So I would start by saying, just empirically, I did look at where these people were from. So what places of origins they were citing, and I couldn't find, there's this very small sample, right? So this is not a quantitative analysis, but I couldn't find evidence that, for example, free slaves in Italy were commemorating their origins from a particularly sort of valuable place more. So more people were saying they were Syrian to show that they were educated or more valuable, and others were perhaps, I don't know, suppressing the idea that they might be a rebellious Gaul or something, right? So I couldn't find evidence for that. One thing I did find was that if anything, there's an emphasis on having been born in Italy itself, which could operate on a number of levels. So you could say, you know, I'm from the core of the empire, but it could also be a claim to sort of lesser level of separation, right? So if you were born, for example, just a few towns down from where you ended up dying, that's a different claim than saying, you know, I've traveled across the Mediterranean and here is where my final resting place is. So that's kind of on an empirical level. But it's also true that the ethnic origins of a slave in the Roman world had monetary value, right? So the Romans were very clear about needing to know where slaves were from on the market, and that there's no evidence that this wasn't circulated among a household and somehow imposed on the cultures of slaves and freed slaves. So there is the idea that ethnicity has economic value, and what I was trying to show was that slaves surely are aware of this, freed slaves are surely aware of this, but are able to use those concepts rhetorically in their monuments in a way that allows us to see perhaps some other issues being explored. So how they were educated to do this has to do with the process of picking an inscription. And you don't have to necessarily be literate to do so, right? So you go to the stonecutter and you say, I'd like X and Y on my monument. So the process of selecting the inclusion of one's ethnic origins or natal origins isn't a question of literacy, it's a question of perhaps knowledge, and the selection of a very kind of uncommon piece of biographical information to include in this particular genre. But there's certainly the idea that these freedmen become Roman in a very clear way by participating in Roman burial culture, and that they use that knowledge to engage in acts of self-representation or representation of loved ones that seem, if you look closely, to be a bit more complicated than a reinscription of the structures that they're in.
Folks, questions?
Yeah, I have a question for Liz. I was really struck by the bilingual inscription where he identifies himself in the Greek part as, and I can't remember what his ethnicity was, but
Charlie's.
Okay, Fuse by nature,
Yeah.
and is that as opposed to Gema by race?
Yeah.
And so does that show up a lot? And what does it mean that he's saying that's his nature? It seems pretty striking to me.
So I think it doesn't show up a lot, but it does show up. So I think it's just another way of saying by birth, but you could say by birth in another way, right?
And
So,
it's like,
doctor.
There's a lot of, do you think it's all Kyle Musicos?
Well, it's possible, right? So it's possible that this man has a particular affinity for that word as opposed to another, but go ahead and say what you're
Or I
going
was
to
just
say.
going to say, because of the idea of slave by nature, it's so kind of ingrained in curriculum thought, and there's a way in which the slave is sort of owning its nature.
Yeah, by nature I was freeborn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Compare, sorry.
Go ahead. You first.
Can you compare the inscriptions of Verna freeborn,
Yeah.
the household born with foreign born? Is there any significant differences?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. So in terms of numbers, in Rome, there's about 600 Verni and about 140 of these nationes inscriptions. But again, this is not a quantitative project, and it's very difficult to make it one. But what that suggests is that these were not something that you would just ad hoc, put on your monument without thinking about it. What's interesting about the Veronai inscriptions is that typically it's the slave owners who are commemorating them. So Veronai tend to be commemorated as such by slave owners, whereas it seems from the work that I've been able to do that slaves and freedmen claim natio for themselves, and there's only a few owners who claim that for their freedmen. Mm-hmm.
So this is for Ortega. So this is a question that is probably totally ignorant and wrong, but I'm going to throw it at you and you can knock me down. So
might not be able to answer it.
well, I might not be able to ask it. So so you've got phenol as one of your key things for this, and you've got Lacan. And so on the one hand, you've got the promise of kind of an existential promise of disalienation, right, from phenol. And then on Lacan, you have a psychoanalytic argument that basically disalienation is itself an illusion. There is no there, and that's what Lacan is demanding that we recognize.
For as long as there is language.
So Lacan is working in a very abstract environment where his audience is primarily, Parisian students. He's not an agent of kind of global decolonization. And Fanon, of course, is writing to a very different audience. And so it's fascinating to me the way you have both these thinkers working in this, to read this document, and I think it works. But I'm wondering if you could play with the tension between that, on the one hand, what Fanon is promising, and what Lacan is saying. The promise that Lacan offers is there's nothing there.
The way I arrived there is through language, right? Because silence in the text kept bothering me, right? So like, how do I approach silence here when, from all accounts, silence is always a negative outcome, right? Not having a voice, it's always negative. But that's where Lacan and Fanon, right, start kind of like getting into this problem of not being able to be without having language, right? You cannot articulate yourself unless you have an image, and then you start kind of using language to, and I love the way you put it, the self-representation, right? So what it fascinated me was that Francisco Manzano seemed to have been very strategic to actually use or recognize that language was what was, in a way, entrapping him and his ability to really find himself for whom he was. Because once again, the language that he had been provided within the colonial context that Fanon was very well aware of, despite the fact that his audience in Paris may have been other, right? He was very aware that the colonial language was always going to create a version of himself within the master text, right? So for me, just arriving and using those two and thinking in terms of the Lacanian version and the narrow stage with the language is something that, knowingly or not, and I would think that not knowingly, Manzano actually intuitively in the text decide to do. Just at the end of the text, he takes off. And he takes off like the Cimarrón, the idea of the Cimarrón, right? It's really constructing a whole new society identity outside of the realm of the discourse of otherness, right? So to me, the connection there is language. However, I completely understand that that's the oxymoron, right? That's the tension there, that is very difficult to really imagine oneself outside of language, and that's, and if you do, then you're nothing. And that's, yeah, I mean, but definitely that's something that I can kind of think a little bit more of how it works with the text and with silence in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. My question was for Gema. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. As Latin Americans, I know what a big deal it is, the Manzano text. It's truly distinct. But I want to sort of, I guess, trouble kind of this idea of it as a strictly Spanish-American text, right? Because, I mean, as you pointed out, the close ties to British abolitionist circles, it's post-abolition, it's published British abolition in 1840, as you said. And I know that it has sort of narrative parallels to slave narratives in the Anglophone world. So I was just wondering if you could just sort of speak to that. Yeah.
That's a great question, right? And that's part of the fascination of this text, right? Because it was written in Spanish that for those who worked on the Spanish was atrocious, they say. So before Madden, and I have it in the larger version of the paper, but I kind of go into it as well. Before Madden translated it, Suarez, who was another protege of Francisco del Monte, corrected the atrocious grammar. So that in itself, it's already another layer of the problem of language, right? So it's beyond like, where does this text come from? Because it definitely doesn't come from Manzano himself originally. Madden translated it. It changes the chronology. It gets published in England for Anglophone audiences. So United States and England would help Cuba to fight against Spain, right? So there is all this convoluted history and context around the production of the text. And I agree with you, to call it a Spanish-American text, it doesn't cut it, definitely. And I think that, and thank you for that question, because now I'm thinking as I'm going, I think it also connects with what I'm trying to say about, where to place Afro-Hispanic text in the context of the Western Hemisphere, right? Transnational for sure, but in my world of world literature, right, that you always have to have your home, right? Is it Cuba? Is it Colombia? Is it Spain? Right? So this probably to me is one of the first texts that really kind of started that question about mobility and the mobility of the previously quote-unquote colonized authors that now are transnational, right? And they kind of depict themselves and they choose. I mean, I'm kind of looking at you because it reminds me of what you were saying, that very consciously choose this question of origin and geography and mobility, and I kind of like, in order to kind of deconstruct also those narratives of origin that are fraught with the colonial value of where you come from, right? It seems that where you come from, it has a tag ascribed to it, right? So like he seems to start problematizing that. So I hear you, I mean, definitely, I don't know, is it a Spanish-American text? I characterize it like that because a lot of the literature does, but I think it can be kind of the precursor of all this more transnational and definitely Afro-Hispanic narratives that don't really have a home in the old colonial ways.
Well, this is sad indeed that we have run out of time.
We're out.
Thank you.
Yeah.